Good morning, good afternoon, everybody worldwide to this OPC Foundation webinar about an OPC Ua technology demonstration. Today, we are having Randy Armstrong. He is a security architect from the OPC Foundation, and he will give us an overview, introduction, and a live demo on the topic using OPC Ua with JavaScript, Json, and simple REST-like APIs. The presentation slides and the recording will be made available later public on the OPC Foundation webpage, and we are sending out an email to all of the more than 800 registered attendees of this webinar. Before we start with Randy on the topic of today, I just give you a very short overview on the OPC Foundation. Status today, the OPC Foundation is an international non-profit organization where we combine IT companies and automation companies to solve the vision of providing a secure and reliable, completely independent infrastructure to move information with integrated industrial interoperability from sensor to enterprise and cloud. This independent means we are completely independent from vendors, from any operating system platform or language implementation. Ensure this is open for any kind of markets. It's not only factory or process automation world or energy world. Meanwhile, it's also inside industrial kitchen equipment. The deliverables which are available from the OPC Foundation is that everything what we do is open, the O from OPC. Once specifications get release candidate, they are public to the world. You don't have to be a member of the OPC Foundation. Source code, as an example, is available as open source on GitHub for easy evaluation. The OPC Foundation labs are open to everybody. You don't have to be a member of the OPC Foundation to go to a lab and test your product and increase quality of your product, what we highly recommend. Sure members will have a bonus, a benefit, and a little bit discount. Sure, we are doing marketing in different markets around the world. And so overall, we believe that the OPC Foundation is the world's largest ecosystem providing industrial interoperability with a market for toolkits from OPC members to give you a quicker ramp up, but also education on technology and how to do it again. We are also proud to have one of the most modern IPR policies of the world, which are not only protecting OPC members, instead OPC members agreed on a non-aggressive agreement to not start suing everybody who implemented and who is using OPC Ua. As you see, status of today, the OPC Foundation has over 750 members worldwide. A little bit more than the half is in Europe. And overall, what we recognize right now is that Europe and Asia is very strongly growing, and we will take care that also other regions have enough information for the future. You see the board of directors, which is a mix of IT, world-class companies like Microsoft and SAP, but also automation companies, what you see here. Where do you get more information from the OPC Foundation? Obviously, please join our OPC Foundation web. And just as 3 examples, besides you can download all the specifications and companion specifications, but you see here that we have something to read, the OPC updated OPC brochure, where you also see a lot about collaborations, a small update on technology, but also we integrated a few pages about the new initiative called Field Level Communications, where the OPC Foundation is extending using new underlying IT infrastructure. If you just want to listen, please go to our OPC new podcast, which is distributed by different channels, iTunes, Spotify, Google, or on your computer. But there are also a lot of YouTube videos on our OPC YouTube channel where you can have perfectly a ramp up on learning about what is the technology, how has security been integrated by design, about certification, and much more. Also, open is our roadmap. So you see exactly what has been integrated into the recent standard of version 1.04, which is public outside since begin 2018, but also what the OPC Foundation internally is working right now and what is on the roadmap for the future. So really a lot of topics here, which always have been initiated by members. So the big benefit of being a member of the OPC Foundation is exactly if you want to get early information about the direction, and if you want to influence the direction of the OPC Foundation and of your companion specification, then please join the OPC Foundation and send your recommendations and requirements to the group members, which you find described in the web. With this, I like to ask you to subscribe to our newsletter, then you stay in touch with us and you get all informations. And with this, I like to hand over to Randy Armstrong, the security architect of the OPC Foundation, to give us an update on exactly the topic of today. Again, as a summary, we are sharing the slides and the recording to everybody. You have noticed that we run, unfortunately, over the limit here of our distribution tool. I'm apologizing for that. We will take care of what happened here. It's a very successful format, which we will repeat for other topics very soon. So stay in contact with us. I'd like to thank you for your time. And now I hand over to Randy to give the technical presentation. Randy.
Well, good morning, afternoon, wherever we happen to be today. We see we have a huge turnout. Just to give you some context for the discussion today, one of the things that I've heard a number of times is that, oh well, OPC Ua doesn't do REST, or I want to be able to use REST with OPC Ua, and I want something that's simple and easy to that allows me to quickly put together simple communication. And from my perspective, where I've been involved in OPC Ua for the last 15 years, and I've been on the core team developing.
Randy, there is a feedback that somebody doesn't see slides.
Okay.
Can somebody? I'm unmuting the audience. Can somebody from the audience give us feedback if you see everything?
Yes, we can see the slide.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Then please, Randy, continue.
And anyways, as I was saying, is our objective here is I want to talk about the capabilities that are baked into the OPC Ua specification to allow you to do some very simple and very powerful interactions with OPC Ua servers using mechanisms that are in the specification based on technologies like REST, JSON, and JavaScript. So to give you a little bit more background in terms of our overall vision for the OPC specification, one of the things we realized almost immediately when we started working on this was technology evolves over time, and not every technology can meet every requirement. So it was very important for us to have an architecture that could be adapted to meet the different needs and different needs as they evolved over time. So at the top of the architecture are the information modeling, which is this powerful mechanism for representing information, and it's a very abstract way of describing that is disconnected from how you actually physically get that information across the wire, and this is deliberate. And But in order for you actually to build a real application, you have to be able to have a way to get that information between two different applications. And that's where the Part 6 definitions come in. These are mappings. Part 6 is all about mappings to specific technology. And these mappings have three different components. So the first thing you need to do is that if you have information that you need to get from a server back to a client or a client back to the server, you need to be able to take that information and put it serialize it into a stream of bytes that can be sent over a connection. That is we call serialization. And the term we use in the OPC Ua specification is data encoding. So if I talk about data encoding, I'm talking about serialization. And so the OPC Ua specification supports a number of different parallel serialization mechanisms that can be used interchangeably, specifically JSON, XML, and a binary encoding, which each have their own different purposes. And then once you have those bytes, you need to be able to secure them. That's a topic for another webinar in terms of the secure channel layer. So I'm just going to jump over that. And the bottom layer is you need to be able to get those bytes across the wire for one to be. And that's where the transports come in. And that's where HTTPS and WebSockets show up. Now, the data encodings, as I mentioned, are a way of serializing information that's described in the OPC Ua information model. So you could have the same information be represented in different formats. So in the example here, we've got a binary represented as a binary value as XML or as JSON. Now, it's important to note that JSON was not part of the original OPC Ua specification. It wasn't something that people really cared about back in the mid 2000s. We've added it recently in 1.04, and that is a real powerful illustration of the flexibility of the OPC Ua architecture. That we could say, okay, well, there's this new need that's appeared in the marketplace, and we're going to be able to adapt the specification to support it. And because of the architecture, which is baked into all the different stacks that have been developed, it's relatively easy for the stacks to now be updated to support the new encodings and the new transports as required. And all of the demos that we're going to be doing today are based on this .NET standard stack, which is available on GitHub, and it has been extended to support the technology that you see demonstrated today. Now, when it comes to physically getting the data across the wire, the primary way to do this with OPC Ua is to use TCP. It's the most versatile and reliable way of getting information between two machines. However, it won't work in all cases. There are many circumstances where IT departments impose restrictions, or you have to go through a firewall, and the ports are locked down to 443, or the IT department says, well, if you're going to give me any traffic, it has to be HTTPS because I want to be able to do deep packet inspection on it. There are numerous situations, which are real situations that we can't avoid, and TCP simply won't work. So OPC Ua provides a mechanism to add additional transports to solve these different use cases as they come up. And that's where HTTPS and WebSockets fit in. They exist as part of the suite to give people options when you're dealing with some more restrictive environments. And they're intended to exist in parallel to the TCP connections. So you'd never have a situation where a server would only support HTTPS. It would most likely support multiple protocols. Now, if you've never done any work with OPC Ua, you will realize fairly quickly that everything seems to be based on the concept of a session. You create a session, then after that you can do all of the other stuff you might want to do: read, write, subscribe, you name it. And this is heavyweight. It's got a bunch of state that's being stored on the server, which creates potential issues for some applications. However, a lot of the OPC Ua services don't really require a session, which is why we introduced this concept into part 1.04 called sessionless service invocation, where basically we say, well, okay, if you're not subscribing, you just want to read a value, you don't need a session. So here's how you do that. We spec'd all that out. And this gives you the possibility of doing simple REST-like calls to a UA server and getting back results. Now, obviously, if you don't have a session, you have to take care of some of the stuff that the session was doing for you, specifically user authentication. That when you had a session, you would authenticate the user at the create session, and you simply reuse that user authentication. Whereas if you're doing simple sessionless calls, you now have to do that invocation every time. You have to authenticate every time you connect. And that's where OPC Ua has been able to leverage off commonly used standards in the industry to help us with that. So specifically, OAuth 2 is a mechanism that's used by many websites to federate identity management and allow you to authenticate users without requiring every UA server to know about every user out there. So the demo that we're going to be doing today is been built with ASP.NET Core, with IIS running on Azure, and JavaScript, HTTP and WebSockets, and the .NET reference server, which is all checked into GitHub. There's a special branch for all the code related to this demo. And I'll show you where the links are shortly. So, and this sort of gives you the overall flow that you're going to see in terms of the demos. We pull back a page, and then from there, we read the request with the access token that we got from the OAuth 2 server, and that goes to the reference server, and then it comes back. Now, the IIS in the middle, it needs to be in the middle for these kinds of requests because of cross-site scripting. Browsers are very restricted environments nowadays for obvious reasons. So this you can't talk directly to the reference server. If you were developing your own server from scratch, then you would set up your HTTPS certificate and your domains that you wouldn't necessarily need that redirection. So now we're going to switch back to the website. Now this website is prototyping.opcfoundation.org. It will be a sort of a permanent site where we'll be putting up different technology demonstrations over time. So this is a little bit of an introduction here. So, and this gives you links to where the code is. And also, if there's any questions or feedback or further discussion after this webinar, you can post it on the OPC Foundation forum, where you can find a link here. And just for purposes of this demonstration, we have a WordPress instance which will be providing the user authentication services. So in order to authenticate with the server, we have to log in to the WordPress instance, and there's a couple test accounts that have been set up. So with the first demo is going to be a simple read. So what we have here is a form where I'm entering in the node ID. The node ID normally you would get by browsing the server. You wouldn't normally type it in. But in order to keep this this particular demo, nice and simple, we just enter it in manually. So I hit read. So what you see here is the web page is using JavaScript to construct a relatively simple JSON object. And this is posted to the server using HTTPS. And in that message, among other things, includes this the identifier for the node that you would like to read. The response I get back, in this case, includes a service result, which is this long code. There's a whole bunch of error codes that are given numeric values in Opc Ua, and they all have associated text. And this, if you're writing software, you have to be able to map those codes back into human readable text. In this case, the JavaScript in the page maps that code back into user identity token rejected, which basically tells me I forgot to provide any user authentication. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in. And I've logged in. Unfortunately, since this browser, I've been testing with this browser, it's cached my credentials and it didn't bring up the WordPress login page. Normally I would go to the WordPress login page and I would type in my username and password, and then it would redirect me back to this page, and you now see that I'm logged in as Alice. So we'll do the read again. And now we get a value. And you could take a look at the response. Again, we have a very simple response that comes back that includes the value. And each time we read, we can see the value changes. Now, the exact same pattern repeats with the write. So in the case here, we're writing the value. We can change that to. So we see the value change to 1, 2, 3, 4. The response comes back with the result of 0. Indicate 0 means everything is good. And we can pull up a off-the-shelf test client. And you can see that in this test client, the value changed to 1, 2, 3, 4. So what's happening is I've got two different connections to my UA server. This test client is going back direct using the TCP. For purposes of this demo, I've opened up a port in our firewall on the cloud server to make that possible. Normally, you wouldn't do that, but this was just to sort of show that we're all going back to the standard UA server, and it's all via that interface. And the same pattern repeats again for the call method, where the call method itself is a very powerful mechanism where you can specify in your information model a number of input arguments, and you get back a number of output arguments. In this case, we have a bunch of test methods that will do different mathematical operations, and as you can see, we're getting the right result as I'm calling the different methods. And if you take a look at the actual request, you see you have your input arguments, and in the response, you get your output arguments. And so, all of these structures, so all of the text and all of the names here are all clearly documented in the Opc Ua specification. So if we take a look here, and we see things like the response header, the results, and all of those different parameters. We can click here and we can go to the online description for the call service. And you see the exact same thing. You see request getter, methods to call, and then you have the input arguments, and then the output argument results, and diagnostic info. So and all of these parameters are now fully described in the specification. And so it's easy to sort of build and construct these JSON messages. You've got the documentation sitting there online, allowing you to know what you're trying to put in there. And of course, you've got with JSON, all of the JSON messages automatically get converted to objects, which make it easy to work with the messages. You don't have to do any special parsing in JavaScript because it's done automatically. Now, the last demo is a little different. Now, for the first 3 demos, it was all based on the principle that you would take a JSON request, you would post it to the server, and you would get back a response using the sessionless invocation mechanisms that are built into Opc Ua. The last one is for subscribing. For subscribing, what we're doing is we're creating a WebSocket connection. And once you've established a WebSocket connection, you are now using full session-based Opc Ua, where user authentication is done in the create session method using the mechanisms that are common to all the other Opc Ua clients. And you now have a two-way channel, which is between the browser and the server, which is suitable for getting asynchronous updates to data. So what I did is I connected to the server, and now I'm getting updates. I'm basically subscribed to that double. So if I want to subscribe to a different one, I can, for purposes of the demo, I'm just going to manually enter it in. So now we're going to do a uint32. And we see we're getting different values here. And you can sort of see the JSON message that comes back. Again, a lot of parameters in here that have different purposes and different circumstances. They're all documented on the website. So it's at the core level, this is a very simple demo intended to illustrate the technology. But I'm hoping that you're all sort of seeing this and you're sort of realizing the different possibilities and how with these basic tools you could potentially create some very interesting and compelling Opc Ua applications. That is basically the end of the demonstration, and we will be opening it up to questions from the floor.
Well, first of all, Randy, I'd like to thank you very much for this presentation. We are stopping the recording here right now, and but still are open for answers. First of all, thank you again very much for this impressive presentation. Thank you, Randy.
Yeah, so we got lots of time here to get through all these questions here. I'm just trying to figure out. I'll try to start from the beginning. Okay, so there's a comment about Node.js. Yes, Node.js does things. They developed a. There's really 2 different ways you could approach this, and a lot of people out there have created a mechanism where they create their own sort of backend, that talks using standard Opc Ua TCP communication to the server, and then but the interface from the web server back to the JavaScript, it's a custom mechanism that was developed for whatever technology was there. And nothing that we're talking about here makes those solutions less useful, or it doesn't mean they go away. You could still do that. The point of this demonstration was to illustrate that there's stuff that's baked into the protocol that could be used directly. And there's going to be cases where the Node.js's and those kinds of technology are just going to be a better platform for people to start with. And you certainly can, I would expect people to continue to use them.
Randy, also please read the question, that everybody knows the question. I don't know if the questions also got recorded.
That was the question. We were already using Node.js. How does this differ from that? Okay, how would you provide test accounts for this demo? I'd be interested. Well, the demo itself is on the public website. There are 2 test accounts that are already there. It's just a generic WordPress instance The text accounts are listed on the front page. Here, tells you what the test accounts are. A question about authentication is active through the entire session. I'm assuming that's talking about once I logged in, the context is remembered. So each time I switched between the different pages, it was the web browser was remembering kept track of the access token that I got from the WordPress instance, and I was using the same token each time I connected to the server. Question about how can we connect to the reference server using the UA interface. That's a simple connection using TCP, OPC Ua over TCP. There's a port which we've opened in our firewall to allow any OPC Ua client to talk to the reference server, to allow people to sort of appreciate the fact that this website is going back and talking to the same underlying server. Okay, can you show details of the authentication? Yes, I would like to be able to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up an Encoding window, and I'm going to log in when I don't have any saved cookies. So hopefully I will be able to show you the actual login pages. So now what happens, I log in. Okay, so here's the WordPress login page. I enter that in, and now it comes back. So I hope that's what the question was looking for when it comes to details of the authentication. There are no plans to build or publish a JavaScript client library. The OPC Foundation is in the business of providing specifications. We want to leave it to the community to develop solutions. I know there's a lot of solutions that I've heard about, some solutions that already exist. I encourage anybody who already has solutions to post them on the forum that we've set up there, so people will have a resource where they can go and look at what the other alternatives are. The OPC Ua specification with Json is, yes, it's available. It's part of 1.04 release that was been released a couple years ago, and it's you can get it at reference.opcfoundation.org or download from the website. In order to access the data, you need to know the available nodes. Is it possible to browse the server? Yes. I could have put together a demonstration where I was using sessionless calls to browse the server, and I thought about sort of showing tree navigation. I thought that was going to end up being a little too complex for what I was trying to accomplish with the demo, so I limited ourselves to read, write, and call. But there's no reason why you couldn't do full tree-based access in your browser using browse. And then you would allow you to find the nodes and then pick them. Yes. No ports need to be open for the JSON communication. Well, obviously HTTPS port needs to be open, but that's the only one that needs to be open. Is this language independent? Yes. Please, I used ASP.NET simply because that was a handy tool I had. Any backend could be used to implement this. It's your choice, or running any operating system. And another one, the same thing. Yes, there's no requirement to use C# or anything like that. It's all about taking the JSON messages, sending them to the server, and then getting the response back. Is there guaranteed performance for full-featured profiles without sessions? No, well, there's in general, the performance that you're going to get out of an OPC Ua application depends on the server implementation and what the requirements of that server implementation are. And if you're using something like sessionless communication and JSON, you may find that you should expect to find that the performance is not going to match what you could get with TCP binary and basically a full session setup, because the session, the binary, all of that's designed to optimize communication. What you will also find if you're looking at real servers, that depending on which nodes you're accessing, you're going to get different performance, because the servers have to go and get the data from somewhere. In some cases, it's more difficult to get the underlying data, which means it takes longer. You get worse performance. But of another node, you'll get better performance. Does this apply to the new definitions introduced in the spec, like unions, nulls, and structures? Yes, and that's one of the important philosophies, is that we have these generic concepts in UA, such as unions and structures, and whenever we introduce an encoding, we provide a representation for every one of those constructs. So if you go into part 6, you'll see an explanation. How do we represent a union in JSON? How do we represent a UA union in JSON? So those are all covered off. Are all OPC Ua methods available? More specifically, historical data access. Yes. In part 4, there's a number of service calls, and there's an explicit list of services which may be invoked in a sessionless context. And the historical services are available. The ones that are not available are going to be related to subscriptions. You can't do subscriptions in a sessionless context.
Randy, one more question here, because I think it fits to the content of method calls. Can you answer if it's also possible with UA method calls to extend the namespace, some more variables or nodes or whatever? Well, in case the server let you do this by security reasons and so on, you have all the credentials to do it.
Oh, yes. You could create a server that would allow people to create arbitrary methods that could then be invoked. The methods themselves are a simple RPC mechanism that's within the UA framework, and so the advantage is that you could have an information model. You can have a method that's attached to a very specific context, such as an object representing a temperature sensor. It can have a method attached to it, and then you can interact. You can then interact with that method, but you would be doing it with simple HTTP posts and responses.
Thank you.
Can user-defined structures be converted to JSON? Yes. All of the encoding rules that apply to. So if we go back to the just to give you a better illustration of this point, when I put up this model here, I said, okay, we've got this user-defined structure representing a car, and that looks like something like this. Now, if we go back to the read method, so we read a value and we get the response. What you see here is the body, in this case, is this negative number that is a float. But if this particular variable happened to be user-defined structure, then it would be it would actually have another JSON object that would actually have all those fields in there, and that's how it would show up. So it's all be nicely in line, exactly as you would expect it to be. Now, I would actually try to do a demo here, but I didn't try that beforehand, and given the rule about demos, changing your demos online, I don't want to risk it till I've actually tried it. In terms of scalability, yes, there's no reason. in terms of scalability, would this work on Docker infrastructure? There's no reason why it would not work on a Docker infrastructure. It's just generic ASP.NET Core code that could go in there. You could use PHP, you could use Python, you could use whatever you want in the background, and it should still work. Is this prototype only works with the .NET standard service? At this point, yes. See, what you need to find in order to work with this is you need to have a server that supports the JSON transport, the JSON encoding, and the WebSockets transport. At this point in time, there's a limited number of servers that are available. And what you're more likely to find is you'll find aggregating servers that will allow you to chain multiple servers together in order to allow you to get access to data in servers that don't support it. What specific components need to be installed and configured at the Opc Ua server end? Well, you install the Opc Ua server. You have to have IIS and some sort of website backend, and then you have to. But that's pretty much it. You only need to configure your web server. Dynamic data such as waveforms. Any data in UA would, in theory, be supported. You would get back, if you have waveforms, if they're coming back as arrays, you will probably find that the JSON is going to get quite large quite quickly, which might make it more challenging. But other than that, it should work. Yes, it does. Does the reference server implement Opc Ua plus UACP over WebSocket? Yes, it does. It does use the binary. It does implement complete security. You can take a look at the GitHub for more details. How do you compare this with the project developed by some researchers at University of Catalina, Italy? I am not familiar with that specific project, but it wouldn't surprise me that it's probably very similar to what other people have done. Certainly, lots of people have tried to solve the JavaScript problem in different ways, and those solutions are going to continue to be useful. And this is not meant to take away from those. This is meant to explain how these capabilities are baked into the specification and are available to be taken advantage of it. What about security issues with Java? Security is always a big issue. If you're developing a website, you're going to have to watch out for those kinds of things. And any UA server that allows connections from a web browser is going to have to be designed to deal with the risks that come along with that. One of the problems with JavaScript is cross-site scripting, which requires that you have to go back to the same site that the page came from, and so you need to design around that. Oh, okay. In this demo, have you permitted the Opc Ua server to transmit through the firewall? Yes, for purposes of the WebSocket, we have, if we go here, you'll see an additional port. This port has been opened. Now, it's also with WebSockets, what you can also do is you can tunnel it through port 443, and I have done this with previous demos, is where you're going back to the original server. For this case, I wanted to show connections. I was testing different connections to different servers, so each one of them ended up with a different port, but there's no requirement that you have to be using a different port. How are OAuth2 tokens linked to security profiles of the UA server? This is going to be up to the server. In the case of the reference server, it just simply records the username and says, okay, this is the user that I got for this particular operation, and lets that user do whatever it needs to do. In a complete OAuth2 server that issues JSON web tokens with scopes and roles, we have an entire mechanism set up where you can do role-based security by where the UA server looks at the roles that are in the JSON web token and it assigns privileges based on those roles. So there's some very powerful mechanisms sort of built in there that can be taken advantage of. In the case of the WordPress OAuth implementation, it doesn't actually use JSON web tokens. It just uses simple simple codes. So though that level of sophistication is not possible with the OAuth2 server that I happen to be using for this demo. Using different backend means that it can't benefit from this technology. IS. Well, no, it's every different technology that you have in terms of the backend technology. There's going to be trade-offs. If you want to, it's up to whoever's developing the website to decide what backend technology makes sense for them. From the point of view of the web browser, all the web browser is doing is posting JSON to the server. So as long as there's a web server in the background accepting those requests, then everything should work, and you shouldn't have any problems using different backend technology. And if you want to use IIS and C#, you can obviously use that. Does OPC Ua also support service-to-service OAuth2 without any user contact? Yes, the mechanisms that are defined in Part 6 do allow for client-based authentication, where the OAuth server assigns credentials to the client, which are then passed, which allow you to authenticate without bringing up that user interface. One of the challenges, obviously, with OAuth2 is that it tends to be set up for use. A lot of the patterns are for use with the browsers, which is more limiting if you're doing service-to-service communication. Many are disabling Java and HMI due to security issues like SIEM and BNR. Yes, obviously there are lots of security issues, and you would not want to use an interface like this if you have any security concerns. And that's one of the reasons why OPC Ua has most of our focus has been on the TCP communication, because it's a lot easier to manage the security issues in those particular cases. This is about giving this demo and this technology is about giving people choices when those choices are appropriate. It's not about saying, oh, you always have to do it this way or you always have to do it that way. It really depends on what the requirements of your application are. What are the benefits of this method compared with the RESTful information with open? Well, the OPC Ua provides a information modeling framework. So what a lot of different organizations are doing is they're taking their knowledge, and whether you're talking about machine tools or robots or coffee maker or kitchen equipment, and they're saying, okay, we're going to describe all this information using the UA information model, and they publish these information models. And now, so you've got this infrastructure that's being built and being created and being described. And so And if you want, and now you're saying, okay, well, I want to access this information via a RESTful API. Well, if you said you wanted to use, let's say, I guess, some other mechanism, you now have to create a mapping between these information models and this other RESTful API that you would like to use. Whereas if you're using this particular mechanism, you don't have to create that mapping. The mapping's already defined by the specification. And so you have this direct, you can go directly from these information models, which are defined by all these different organizations for different verticals based on different requirements, and you now have access to those directly without any additional effort. In addition, when you're invoking methods via these interfaces, you also have context, which is part of the information model. So you're not just connecting back to the server. You have this tree hire. You've got an object, and you're invoking a method on an object, which you could do that the equivalent with simple RESTful technology, but the advantage is now with this approach is you're tying it directly into the objects that you would be seeing if you're connecting using a standard UA client. So it's all about how do you quickly integrate these kinds of web applications into your UA applications. And that has advantages. Is there any documentation for complete HTML JavaScript implementation? This is a proof of concept, so I'd have to say there's probably the only documentation you're going to find will be the specifications, which will tell you how you have to construct the messages by simply looking at the service parameters, and that tells you all of the things that need to go into the JSON messages. If we develop an Opc Ua server of our own, can we create it from the nodes from a configuration of YAML file? If you're developing your own server, you could load your nodes using whatever format works for you. The Opc Ua specification defines an XML-based syntax for representing node sets, which could be used. However, YAML is obviously a very commonly used in a lot of different circumstances, and that could also be used. But that would be custom. That would be code specific to your server at this point in time. We haven't defined a standard for doing that with YAML, but there have been discussions about adding that to the specification. Is the same functionality in Opc Ua is available in Opc DA versus Opc Ua? No. Opc DA, Opc Classic is based on DCOM. That's all it is. There's no other way to communicate directly with an Opc Classic server. Opc Ua is our next generation technology that introduces this concept of flexible protocols and transports and encodings. Because it can happen that the device supports OPC REST, why use this on top of REST? Okay, again, if you're already developing your own open API REST interfaces, then yes, you can do this technology. There's no reason that you couldn't solve this same problem in a different way. Just like different applications create their own or simple web front ends to UA servers using TCP, and then they have their own APIs that the JavaScript would interface with. There's lots of different solutions are possible, and different applications are going to have to make their own decisions. This is about saying, here's a choice that's available to you. And the advantage is that you might get much cleaner integration with your existing OPC Ua information models. And you also have a potential to be able to reuse your implementation with multiple servers. So if you define a bunch of REST APIs that work with your particular server, your back end is only going to be able to talk to your server. But if you have if you use the generic ones, you could potentially talk to anybody's server. Does OPC Ua support the MQTT protocol? Yes, that is part of the pub/sub specification, and this is where one of the main uses of Json will be creating messages that will get sent out via MQTT. That's an entire different discussion for a different webinar and about those particular mechanisms.
Yeah, Randy, to give you a short break, and you can have a, because there are a lot of questions more, I can add a little bit here. The most biggest mistake what a lot of people have is the perception that OPC Ua is a protocol only. And that's why we sometimes get exactly these kind of questions. Should I use OPC Ua or MQTT? And this is fundamentally wrong. OPC Ua is a framework to move information in a secure way from a sender to a receiver, to a listener. And because there's not one protocol in the world which could establish and fulfill all requirements in the world, starting from the very low level of deterministic real-time in the factory automation, up into levels of TCP and UDP in the factory, or into the web with more pub/sub and AMQP and MQTT. That's exactly why OPC Ua is delivering let's say a set of functionalities like Lego bricks, and you can select what kind of Lego bricks you need to establish this kind of interoperability. And OPC Ua defined data, semantic and interfaces can be transported via TCP and UDP and MQTT, and we are able to also involve new IT infrastructure for the future, like the TSN for time-sensitive network, for deterministic, or Ethernet APL for the process automation world, or 5G and so on. This is exactly the flexibility and gives you all the capabilities and opportunities for the future. So Randy, did you recover a little bit? Can you continue?
Yes, yeah, that's good. So thank you for your, okay, what is the limit of the update rate in a real web HMI implemented this way? Well, the update rate that you're going to get in any web HMI is going to be a function of the latency between your browser and your server. And it's going to be a lot slower than what you would expect to get from a TCP connection, which is why a lot of OPC Ua applications are going to prefer to use TCP when it's possible. But I don't have any specific numbers that I could give you. It's going to be up to your implementation to determine what performance limits there are. You want to see maybe you could show the authentication per request in the debug tools. Well, yes, I was avoiding showing debug tools because I thought that might be a little too much detail, but I can pop that up for people who are, where are we here? Okay, I can't quite remember how to find the headers in Edge right now, so I'm not going to be able to do that live. But yes, there shouldn't be any.
Randy, why not make an extra session about that? Sounds be very interesting for a couple of attendees here. So why not schedule a new webinar for that one?
Yeah, we could potentially walk through that. But like I said, it's going to take a little bit more prep work to actually do something reasonable with that. Can you describe the difference between the reversible and the non-reversible JSON encoding? Yes, the reversible JSON encoding is designed to make sure that whatever information you've encoded into the JSON document can be decoded back at the other end without any loss of information. So you could transparently, you can go back and forth as many times as you need, or convert to binary, and it's all going to work. And it's meant for communication between two OPC Ua applications. However, this reversible encoding includes a lot of stuff which is very specific to OPC Ua, and as a result, it's not going to give you the friendliest JSON document if you're handing it off to somebody else, some other application that doesn't know anything about OPC Ua. We added in the reversible encoding, so you could have a situation where a server is producing a JSON messages that's being sent over or out over transport, such as an MQTT broker, and that's being picked up by some generic data analysis tool sitting in the cloud, and this message itself would be condensed, removes all the UA specific stuff, and basically gives you the information. And then that information can then be mapped into whatever mechanisms you have in the background. Are there any discussions with Open 62.541 since they are certified, so these new features are supported? Well, Open 62.541, it's a project that is run independently of the OPC Foundation. If you have any requests for features, you're going to have to take with that particular stack. You're going to have to take it up with them. It's not something that we get involved in.
Yeah, and I'd like to add your comment. This is an open source project, but you can never ever certify a stack or an SDK. You always can only certify an application which is maybe built on top or with help of that SDK or tool or source code. And yes, there has been an application being certified, but even then you have to check which kind of base profile has been certified as a basic requirement. If it's just a super low, small requirement for a nano service, then these kind of implementations and features might not have been tested. So please check that application and what level has been tested in detail.
Okay, then we have a JavaScript solution, a reference to that. Yes, if you have any existing JavaScript solutions, please feel free to post links to them on the forum, so people will have there's a on the homepage here, there's a link to the place to put it there, and that would allow you to give people a place to go looking for those kinds of things. How do you see Python, Java, and security with OPC Ua, all scripting web levels posing security questions? Yes, yes. Scripting at a web level is a huge issue, and it's not. It has its purpose. It has its role, because there's some cases where it makes sense to do that, and in a lot of cases, if I was designing a UA server, I would likely have some sort of aggregating server that would be handling the web front end, that would be designed to be robust, and would also have very limited access. Possibly read-only or other restrictions. These are kinds of questions which your architects need to look at and make decisions to minimize the security risk, because we shouldn't sort of dismiss this, because security with these web-based technologies is a huge issue. And if you're not careful, you could find yourself in a very bad situation because you didn't take this stuff into account when the system was developed. What happens when you get back and you get a continuation point returned? The specification has, in the session list descriptions, has requirements that the server maintain continuation points for the session list request. So the continuation points is kind of the minimum level of stateful information which the server has to keep track of in order to support session list requests. Do you have a sample to demonstrate the reverse connect feature? Well, that sounds like a good topic for another webinar. Yes, there are samples in the open source code that's on GitHub, but we could probably put together a better explanation for it. How do you see the security with authorizations turned off? Well, if you have a server where you happen to want to make all the data publicly available and it's read-only, then yes, you could convince yourself that the security risks for allowing a no authentication server accessible via JavaScript would be manageable. When you're dealing with industrial automation, a lot of times this isn't even an option, and you shouldn't really be entertaining the possibility. But again, it's an option that's available, but it's going to depend on your project requirements to determine whether or not it's an acceptable option. Have you received any requests for future support for other open binary encoding such as Protobuf? Although the I think this is an important point to sort of emphasize is the architecture for Opc Ua allows for multiple encodings and multiple transports. And however, at the same time, we don't want to create this huge Swiss Army knife of a standard that has so many options that it just becomes completely unmanageable. So the working group has a very strict policy when it comes to adding in new transports and new encodings. It's the question we always ask: does this allow us to do something that simply could not be done with our existing options? And when it came to Json, there were some obvious cases, because you have these big data engines sitting in the cloud that ingest JSON or XML, and they're not going to know about Opc Ua. And that was a very clear use case. We said, well, this allows us to do something more. Now, if you're talking about something like Protobuf, which is basically doing the same thing as UA binary but doing it differently, it's not adding us any value. There's no reason for us to add support for Protobuf into Opc Ua, because we've got a solution and it works. So it just adds complexity without any benefit. How do you evaluate the risk of leaving non-authorized Opc Ua server open for connections? How do I evaluate that? Well, this is, again, it's going to depend on the server that you're building. What kind of data do you have access to? Is it sensitive? How sensitive is this data that it has access to? And then, of course, you're going to have all of the back-end infrastructure about how's that server protected against DOSs? How you're protected against other kinds of common web attacks. This is all work that has to be done by the architects before you could come up with a complete solution. And from that perspective, it's outside of the scope of this particular discussion. Can an extension object be encoded and decoded through JSON? Yes. Extension objects are a base Opc Ua concept. Every base Opc Ua concept has a mapping into JSON. Subscribe is not working for me, whereas read, write, and call do work. Yes, you will find that the WebSockets browser implementations sometimes have issues. On my machine, I can't use Firefox to communicate via WebSockets, but on another machine, I can use Firefox. So I would recommend that if you're having problems, try a different browser or try a different machine. And if you're still having issues, it might be a firewall issue, like your corporate environment may be somehow limiting that. Can I add nodes dynamically? This is a very common use case for methods. What happens is people will define methods with the purpose of adding nodes dynamically. So for example, if you wanted to add a new controller to an area within your Opc Ua server, you would have an add controller method, and you would call that, and you could use the REST interface to invoke that method, and then that would cause all the new nodes to appear. Again, somebody claiming they can't connect to the website. Yes, I would have to check your local configuration. How to authenticate a client server with a custom generated PM format. When you're dealing with a web browser, you can't use certificates. You're limited to whatever the browser gives you. There's simply no way to have any sort of certificate-based authentication in a browser, or without using some non-standard plugin or something like that might allow you to do that. But it's the authentication has to be done. The security has to be based on HTTPS and then whatever authentication protocol such as OAuth 2. Please more Zoom. Okay. Can you post some sample code on Reverse Connect? Yes, the sample code is available on GitHub. Will the JSON be ported to ANSI implementation on GitHub? The ANSI implementation on GitHub is we're not adding new features to that. For that, if you're looking for something open source, I would suggest you have discussions with the Open 65, or you can also talk to there's a number of different stack vendors that provide ANSI versions that you might want to have a discussion with. That they might have something for you sooner. Does the OPC need to be available from the public network? No, it does not. This is an important thing. For purposes of the demo, I opened up a port so I could show you that I was talking to the same server. Normally, you would simply shut that down, and the only access would be via the web server. Does Opc Ua Server support integration with LDAP Active? Yes, with Active Directory in particular supports the OAuth 2 authorization. So you would be able to integrate with OAuth 2 with Active Directory by using OAuth 2 to issue a JSON web token, and then passing that JSON web token to the UA server, which would then go back to the Active Directory to make sure that it's a valid JSON web token. Yes, the source code for all the demos available. The link is on the front page, right here. In this example, is enabled using the .NET. How about the Java JDK found? When it comes to the Java implementation, this is you might want to direct your questions to, I believe, Process. They've been most involved in maintaining their Java stack. They're the people who are most likely to provide this capability. Okay. Is it only through JSON that you can have different user-defined roles? And no, you can. The roles that are defined in the UA server are independent of the protocol used to communicate. Those roles, we've got an entire role model that's defined, and the only thing that you would do is you would map the roles that might be in the JSON web token to the roles in the server, but we have a number of other different mappings which are available. You can find the detailed information in the appendix on roles in part 5. I think we need to mention that I think we need to mention this mechanism only work for recent OPC Ua servers that supports JSON encoding and transport, and not legacy old version any solution for legacy devices. Yes, that is correct. You obviously this will only work if you're talking to a server that supports new protocols. However, with OPC Ua, you have a number of options available, in particular aggregating servers, where you have multiple servers chained together. So you could have a new server that is acting as a gateway that supports the protocol that is simply passing the request through to a downstream server that only supports UA TCP. Is there a standard database of these information models? We're constantly improving this site, but basically all of the different information models are currently available at reference.opcfoundation.org. And so these are all the different ones. So if you want to go in, let's say commercial kitchen equipment, you can go through here and you can see all the different data types and object types that are defined by this specification, and you basically browse through all the available things. We're going to be continuing to improve this site over time, provide better search and query capabilities. And I believe that answered the question. Is there support for G Rpc? I would have to say no. Is it possible to communicate via REST with the discovery server? At this point in time, the standard LDS does not support JSON. Why is OPC Ua not using a MAC address for trusted clients like gateways? And why do we pushing that to the application level? I'm not quite sure where the MAC address would fit into. It would be useful for a browser-based client. It could be used in some circumstances, but it sounds like it's a discussion that's way beyond the scope of this particular topic. Is the request payload structure fixed? The envelope is defined. When you do an HTTP post and you get back the response, the envelope is defined by the specification. You can go into part 4 and you can find all of the fields that can be there for each one of the different services you can invoke. But once you get down to the value, the actual values that are coming back, they can be anything that could be that are defined by the servers. So, for example, when I use the example of a car, you could have a car object that would be the value. So in that sense, the values are not fixed. They can be anything in the information model, but the overall envelope is fixed. Okay. Can you elaborate what we meant by saying REST means different things to different people depending on the definition? It makes no sense to have a REST interface. Okay, with REST, if you want to talk about strict REST, you're talking about a rigid hierarchy where your web request is sort of everything is sort of pushed into this where if each object's identified by a path in your URL, and you could get and you can put that object. Basically you're writing to the URL, you're changing the state, or you're getting back the object state back. It's a very rigid methodology that has advantages in certain circumstances, but OPC Ua doesn't follow that particular rigid methodology. Therefore, we don't want to say that we're doing pure REST, because then people would come back and say, well, you're not following this rigid methodology. Yes, you're correct. We're not doing it that way because it doesn't really fit with the model of OPC Ua, where we've got our own information model that doesn't treat objects in the same way that REST is expecting objects to be treated. I don't see this as a disadvantage. It's just a difference that we needed to call out to avoid confusing people. So how far have you come with TSN and QoS for OPC Ua roadmap?
Randy, I also already answered this. This is completely not content of today, and we are running another TSN-based webinar in the near future.
Okay. Okay, why is this demo sending non-reversible? It's not sending non-reversible. This demo is sending the reversible stuff. So I'm not quite sure where you got that from. Latency with TSN, we're going to defer those questions. 1.02 server cannot support reverse connectivity because it was not in the specification. Reverse connect. In your examples, the node ID was indicated in the JSON body. What was the value of the HTTP request URI? If you want to do REST, shouldn't the node ID then also be in the request URI? And no, this is where the difference between pure REST and what we're doing here, which is more a web API approach, and that's why. Because again, we're trying to map things in with UA concepts. We didn't want to create an impedance. We wanted to create a clean mapping that can be done automatically without any special glue logic. And the consequence of that is the identifiers have to go in the body of the messages, because that was necessary. How can one OPC Ua server to hardware is a secure? Okay, secure boot again is completely out of scope of this discussion, so that will have to be for further webinars in the future.
Right. So I think, Randy, you answered all kind of open questions right now. I stopped being able to add more questions because we run even half an hour over the time, and you answered fantastically all kind of questions to now, and sometimes they are now doubling and so on. I'd like to thank everybody again for joining this webinar of the OPC Foundation and spending the time. But of course, and first of all, I'd like to thank Randy Armstrong, being the security architect of the OPC Foundation, to provide us here with his deepest knowledge and a great overview, but also the introduction and providing the background and the web landing page for all these samples. Take the time to the audience and analyze what's going on, and sure you can join the OPC Foundation if you're a member and send questions. If you have additional questions, please use the forum on the OPC Foundation webpage where we will answer more questions. Stay in contact with the OPC Foundation. We are providing a lot of more webinars in near future about a lot of more topics from lowest level on the TSN questions, but also Ethernet APL, bootstrapping and so on, which all is covered by the Field Level Communication Initiative, but we are also describing a lot of more, giving a lot of more information how to scale from sensor up to IT enterprise and cloud. With this, again, thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.